John Tataryn, and I was born in Sydney, Nova Scotia in 1933. First of all, my mother came with her parents in 1912. She must have been around maybe 8, around that age, 7, 8. And I'm not sure though if my uncle, who was younger, was born in Ukraine, came as a baby, or was born in Canada. But I don't know that part of the history. My grandfather was Machtei Markiu, and my grandmother was Tataryn Michaleshin. 1912, they arrived in Halifax. They left Ukraine because they were very poor, and they were looking for a better future for themselves and their children. And they saw no hope in Ukraine, and that part of Ukraine was overpopulated. There was no land left to divide among your children. They had very little money. Most of the time, immigrants came on borrowed money. They worked hard to repay this money. But what they did bring with them, this is interesting, is homemade tools, a homemade plane, a hammer, and things of that nature. They brought seeds with them. Well, my grandfather brought tobacco seeds. Grew his own tobacco, and flower seeds. They didn't bring wheat seeds with them or any type of grains, because they had no intentions of going Western Canada.
Yes.
Yeah, and they already knew something about the life in Sydney from people who came before them. That I'm not familiar with, but it certainly was, I don't think it was a large amount, because first of all, Canada invited them to come to be pioneers on the prairies. The steel mill and the mining companies, they needed workers badly. And so many of them had to go to Winnipeg and then come back, but a lot of them slipped through the through the regulations to get to Sydney directly, because they needed workers. And the mill eventually employed over 6,000 workers, and that's not counting the coal mines had about many more workers, because there were coal mines all over the island. My grandfather he worked in a steel mill. The steel mill at that time was established by a multimillionaire from Boston, because it was an ideal location for making steel. All the ingredients were there, they had the harbor there, and he his lungs were severely damaged by gases in the steel mill. And the company didn't want to pay any compensation. They had a big hospital right on the grounds with 2 doctors, several nurses looking after these immigrants who were injured while they were working there. So they convinced him it was the sea air that was destroying his lungs. He should go back to Ukraine or to Austro-Hungary to recuperate. But unfortunately, the neighbors wrote a letter to my grandmother that he was dying. She decided to go back with my uncle, because he was under 2 years of age, and she thought she would bury him when he died and sell what little property he had and come back. But she left my mother. She left my mother with neighbors because she couldn't pay for her. When my grandfather, as I say, when my grandmother returned to Ukraine, the First World War broke out. She couldn't come back. When the immigrants came, the Ukrainians and the Polish people united together to form St. Michael's Benefit Society, and they built a hall together because there weren't enough of them to build separately. And then in 1906, the Ukrainians built their own hall, and the Polish built a second hall because the first one wasn't adequate. And then they started to build a church. The Orthodox built the first church in 1910, and they were from Greater Ukraine, not Dnipro. and usually Halachana had nothing to do with them.
Yes, of course.
You know. And then when the revolution broke out, most of them went back to defend the Tsar because they took an oath of allegiance. So that church was closed and sold to a Protestant. The Ukrainian Catholic Church was built and finished in 1912. And then they put an ad in an American Ukrainian newspaper looking for a priest. Somebody clipped out this ad and sent it to Vladeka Budka, who had just arrived in Winnipeg. And he had sent a priest to Montreal because they were building St. Michael's Parish, or organized St. Michael's Parish. He had asked him to go a little further to find out what was going on in Sydney. And he sent him back a telegram. He said, the train couldn't go any further, there was the ocean.
Yes.
And he said, She mashkale rentovale in company houses. They lived in company houses, like barracks.
Yes.
Nobody had their own home at that time. Well, the original community was small, but it kept growing. It kept growing, and eventually we had the Second Orthodox Church and a communist hall. Because because they were great socialists. And matter of fact, our people got into trouble for helping to organize the Steelworkers Union and the Miners Union. They couldn't read or write, but many of them served time in jail because the company police were the provincial police who supported the owners of the steel mill and the coal mines. And when the people went on strike, they declared that there would be no public gatherings, and as a result, the people insisted on going to church. They would go to the Roman Catholic Church first, beat the people that were coming out, the Polish church next, the Italian church after that, and then Ukrainian church was last because their services were the longest. And they would beat the people coming out of church. But the community itself, was in a sense very, very Polonized. They tried to retain the Ukrainian culture as much as they possibly could. We had Rita Shkola, of course, that the pastor, and then later they got a dyak from Winnipeg. And my brother became a dyak at 14. The Orthodox priest trained him to sing. And there was the people tried. They tried hard. There was a Ukrainian dancing group, which was became quite good at dancing, but they had to make their own costumes, and they made costumes as they remembered them, but with the materials they had.
Yes.
They had no books. The books that came from Ukraine were, Polish. There were very few books that would come out, like a bukvar or something would come out in Ukrainian language. So it was extremely difficult. As a matter of fact, all the ethnic groups worked together. During the Second World War, I know the Ukrainians went out and danced at different army camps and whatnot, and the Croatian orchestra played for them. So all the ethnic groups worked together, and they tried to retain their culture as much as they possibly could. The Canadian government advertised. And then once the first one came, he wrote back and said, come, you don't have to go to the prairies. I can, like the first immigrant said, I can get you work in the steel mill or coal mines, you'll make money, and then you can buy pole, the możesz pole kupić, this would be, By steamship, usually took about a month to get here. And of course, third class, they couldn't afford anything else. That time, you just came. And you presented, you were checked at the entry point in Halifax Harbor. The doctor would check you if you had any communicable diseases, and then you came as an immigrant. You're going to the prairies, or sometimes they look the other way so that they can go to Sydney. my grandparents traveled as a family. They had, my father, on the other hand, he came himself. He was 17 when he left home, went to Germany, and made a few Deutschmarks there to come to Canada. He came, and but unfortunately, he had to go to Winnipeg. He had to come back to Sydney. It took him, 2 weeks and a day. His mother died when he was very little. His older sister helped to raise him. And because they were so poor, there was no hope, no future. He didn't want to go into the Austrian army, so he decided to leave when he could, and because he wasn't quite of age yet for the army, so he was able to leave. His father remarried and had children that my father never met, but I did. When I went in 1969, I met them. Reverend. He came to Canada, he was still 17, he came in December. He came in 1913. Came back because he had a job waiting in Sydney. And my mother went to work when she was about 9 years old. She was a babysitter for a doctor from England who came to Sydney, and she was his babysitter for his children. And then when she got older, the matchmakers in Sydney matched her up with my father. So that's how they got married. She was in love with a Polish man, but they said no. Vin pijak, vin duże pije. He gambles, vin nie. So, and because she was an orphan, she had to listen.
Yes,
so that was the custom then. Oh yes, they talked about. First of all, it was difficult for them to communicate because not everybody could read or write.
Right.
They tried to keep contact with their families, but when communism came in, they had to stop writing, because our neighbor had a brother, and in the same silo where my father's from, and he corresponded with him. The communists found out. They hung him in the village to stop people from writing to their relatives. Yeah. So from then on, my father stopped. Half the village was sent to Siberia, and so he couldn't communicate with them. My father's village was Dobriane, near Lviv, Jagielloński, Horodok. My mother's village was in the Ternopilski area. Her village was Hushatinski, Lyon. Horodnice was the village. It was a very large village. No, my mother learned English when she worked for the doctor, but she learned to read when we were going to school. She sat down, make sure we all did our homework, and that's how she learned to read in English. My father learned to read in Ukrainian by himself, because once you learn the alphabet Ukrainian, it's easy to read. In English, it's more difficult. Yeah. And they learned to sign their names, and that was it. Oh yes, yeah. My brothers, my two sisters, there are 6 of us in the family. We were all sent to school when we became of age. There are 3 of us left.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
We didn't keep them and they made everything. When we lived down by the harbor, there were a lot of free lands along the harbor. So the people made their own gardens. They fenced them off. They kept cows, pigs, chickens, geese, ducks, and they made everything. They made fences, takich na sili, yeah, and cowbells. They made their own. It was all homemade. Cribs. Sister Rachel was the last to be raised in a crib, handmade. Everything was handmade. The cultural traditions that I remember is that community get-togethers. They got together in the parish hall. for plays. Almost every Sunday były jakieś przedstawienia, you know. The Veshilia, the dinners and prazdnik and dances they had. It was wonderful just watching the people enjoying themselves. They had a great time. Well, we lived next to the church. So we had to attend all the church services. That was a must. All of the večerja, utranja, postni, vyprave, you name it, we had processions. This was very important. You know, zeleni świata meant going up the hill to the cemetery. We had to carry banners and show it like a procession, you know. And that was an all-day event, you know. He became a jock at 14. He took after my uncle that died, who was a musician. And they used to make their own musical instruments. Mandolins, violins, they made their own. And my brother, he played musical instruments, but he unfortunately died when he was 31 years old. The food was varenike with szkwarke, but there were different kinds. You know, the serum, the zvorobolivi serum, you know, kapustuju. And then when berry season came around, you know, blueberries, you showed it, all kinds of holubchi, because my mother, because she was a great cook, ladies would gather in our house from the neighborhood to exchange recipes. So we had holubchi, Serbian style, Slovak style, we had all kinds, rishi. It was never the same. All the merchants in our part of Sydney, the Whitney Pier, which was a separate section because the steel mill ran right through the city, so there's only one road connecting and went under the railway tracks. So all the Jewish merchants and the Orthodox synagogue was in our section. The conservative synagogue was downtown. That was for the rich Jews. Right. We had the poor Jews, and they all ran we had 2 Jewish doctors, Jewish dentists, and our people, went to these stores and they got the foods that they wanted, you know. So it was you walk down you can go to any store, talk Ukrainian or Polish. And not particularly in the home, although they were, like my father was very much involved in politics. And our home used to be sort of a gathering place for people when they were going to church or coming from church. My mother would bake 22 apple pies at one time, because apples were cheap in Nova Scotia, and we had 22 apple tins, pie tins. So Jude Prikodele, she'd make homemade beer, and for the adults and for the children was root beer in gallons. And we kept it in the basement. Jude Prikodele, she used to treat them, and they used to talk. The men talked politics, the women talked about raising children, Vishavalit, Nifshi, Chelishan, Vishavate, the ones that knew there were more and more that began to pick up, Vishitya. And my mother did a lot of sewing. I have her sewing machine. I kept it. She used to, change clothing for different sizes when the kids were growing up. She collected clothing to help poor women, especially there were, I know French families that were very poor from Newfoundland. They used to come in their fishing boats. How they crossed, I don't know, but they come there to work in the steel mill. How she did it, I don't know. But anyway, as I say, they talk mostly about raising children and things like that. Amushjane, they talk politics. You know, it was always politics. Both in Canada and the Ukraine. Like they were getting more interested in Canadian politics because they went out to vote, and in those days, whether it was a civic election, provincial or federal, all the candidates wanted the support, so they would drive our people to the polls so that they would vote. So naši ljudi privekli from the earliest days to go to vote and to get involved in politics.
Right.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to mention is when you're studying the history of Ukrainians in Nova Scotia, you'll find them listed under Russian very often, or Austrian. I remember in university, there was a student, his name was Jerry Gaidamak. And I went up to him after class and said, Jerry, you're no Gaidamak, you're a Haidamak. He says, how did you know? That's what my grandfather used to say. I said, what was your grandfather? He said, Austrian. I said, your grandfather was Ukrainian, Austrian citizen, but he was Ukrainian. You know, and he was so enthused about that because he didn't know that. You know, and the books that came out about the labor unions, and they said that the biggest promoters were the Polish and Russian immigrants. The Russian were Ukrainians, Russene. And matter of fact, this is an interesting story. After the First World War, the mayor of the city asked all the ethnic groups to make floats. Floats were very popular, you know, and to dress up in their native costumes. And we're going to march down Main Street, Victory Parade. А священник був москофіль, і каже, ми будемо маршувати під російським прапором. А наші люди казали, ні, ми русини, будемо під українським прапором маршувати. My father told me that story. You know? Well, he's Ukrainian. She trying to get bullies Ukraine. You know, they're all from Ukraine. And nobody wanted to come to Sydney because the closest parish was Montreal.
Yes.
You know, that's why the Ukrainian priest, the Polish priest, and the Italian priest used to travel together and, you know, associate together. An interesting thing about the Polish priest, now that their parish is just as old as ours, and their priest died in the, I think it was in the 20s. He died of a heart attack. There was no priest to replace him. So there was a young priest came from Ireland, and the bishop said, have I got a parish for you? He put him there. I mean, Biddy does not know nothing about Polish, you know. And nasz święcienik kaže, don't worry, I will teach you. Nauczył je говорити по-польськи, звичаїв, так далі. He was there for 42 years. We knew very little. During this, there were connections. A family moved in from Thunder Bay, so we knew something about Thunder Bay. You know, Toronto, some people moved to Toronto. For example, the Orthodox priest and his family, when the parish closed down, when the Russian Revolution broke out, he had no money to come here. The Orthodox bishop said, I have a parish, but you have to come to Toronto. So they took a collection in the Catholic Church to pay for his transportation to come to Toronto. So people knew something about Toronto. They knew more about Montreal. You know, families already, when they got Troszka do Robielesza, began to move to Montreal and move to Toronto, Oshawa, Hamilton. You know, they began to move because there were better opportunities. So they began it was gradual. They began to learn more and more about other parts of Toronto. Some had lost connections. Like, you know, on my mother's side, we had lost connections completely. When I went there, thank God for a lady, I know Mrs. Polis, she was active she had a sister in my mother's village. So I asked her to write to her sister to find out, do I have relatives?
Right.
So she came to, in 1969, Aprikla de Ternopolia, waited for me. I came on a train with the youth. Zabrala mnie na salon, and she had two cousins already she found for me. Oh yes, she smuggled me in. She brought me a jacket, told me to put that on, take my glasses off, hide my watch, and don't say a word, because it was out of his dushata. I kazala ticket do četvrti zarav tajmoša. And the chauffeur was very suspicious, or the bus driver was very suspicious, but I think she paid him off.
Yes.
And, but the second time, in 71, when I went in, хтось замірдував, і міліція прийшла мене арештувати, but I had left the day before.
Oh, my goodness.
Twice. I met my mother's family that she never met, and my father's not stepchildren, his brothers and sisters, half brothers and sisters, because his father remarried.
Father, thank you.
Well, you're very welcome.
This is great information for
very
us.
welcome.